The fastest way to discover who someone really is to give them a chance to walk away. The woman at the corner table laughed softly at Ethan Brooks as she stirred her iced tea. That sounds like something from an old movie. Ethan smiled. Maybe, but it is usually true. Evening sunlight filtered through the large windows of the restaurant, painting golden reflections across polished wood tables and glass decorations. It was a quiet place on the edge of Columbus, Ohio. Nothing fancy, nothing extravagant, just good food and a peaceful atmosphere. Ethan preferred places like that. After years of raising his daughter alone, he had learned that comfort mattered more than appearances. Across town, however, another person was having a very different evening. Victoria Sterling sat inside the back seat of a luxury sedan, staring through the tinted window at the restaurant entrance. Her jaw tightened as she watched Ethan through the glass. She could see him smiling. She could see him talking. Most of all, she could see him enjoying himself. And for reasons she could not fully explain, that bothered her. Victoria was the chief executive officer of one of the largest investment firms in the state. She was respected, admired, and feared in boardrooms across the country. She was also used to being in control. Several months earlier, she had met Ethan through a charity event sponsored by her company. Unlike everyone else, Ethan never seemed impressed by her title or wealth. He treated her with simple courtesy and nothing more. Somehow that had stayed in her mind. Then, a week ago, she learned he had agreed to go on a date with another woman. The news irritated her far more than it should have. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. Yet instead of driving away, she opened a small bag resting beside her. Inside were old clothes she had purchased that afternoon. 10 minutes later, Victoria emerged from a nearby alley wearing a worn coat, faded shoes, and a knit cap pulled low over her hair. The transformation was convincing enough that nobody would recognize the powerful executive now walking toward the restaurant. Even she felt slightly foolish. But curiosity and pride can convince people to do strange things. Inside the restaurant, Ethan's date was describing a recent vacation when movement near the entrance caught everyone's attention. Conversation slowed. Several diners glanced toward the door. A woman dressed in worn clothing stepped hesitantly inside. She looked tired. She looked uncomfortable. She looked out of place among the neatly dressed customers enjoying dinner. A few people immediately looked away. Others frowned. Ethan noticed her too. The manager approached first. "Ma'am, can I help you?" Victoria lowered her head slightly. "I was just wondering if anyone had something to eat." A silence settled over the room. The manager remained polite, but clearly uncertain. Ethan watched quietly from across the dining room. His date sighed under her breath. "Please do not tell me this is about to become awkward." Ethan looked at her. "Why would it be awkward?" "Because she is obviously asking for help." Ethan glanced back toward the woman standing near the entrance. Then he stood up. Several heads turned. Victoria felt a sudden wave of uncertainty. This was not how she imagined the moment unfolding. Ethan walked calmly across the room. The manager stepped aside. "Excuse me," Ethan said gently. Victoria looked up. Their eyes met for the first time that evening. He did not recognize her. Not even slightly. "Have you eaten today?" he asked. For a second she forgot she was supposed to be acting. "Not really." Ethan nodded. "Then come sit with us." The entire restaurant seemed to pause. His date stared in disbelief. The manager blinked. Victoria herself almost forgot to respond. "I cannot do that," she said quietly. Ethan smiled. "Sure you can." The woman at his table immediately looked unhappy. The evening sunlight continued pouring through the windows while silence spread across the room. And in that moment, Victoria realized something unexpected. The test she thought she was creating had already begun. The only problem was that she was no longer certain who was being tested. The woman sitting across from Ethan stared at him as if he had completely lost his mind. "You cannot be serious." Ethan pulled out an empty chair beside the table. "Why not?" Victoria remained standing near the entrance. For the first time since putting on the disguise, she felt genuinely uncomfortable. She had expected irritation. She had expected embarrassment. She had expected Ethan to politely avoid involvement and continue his evening. Instead, he was treating her like a guest. "I do not want to interrupt your dinner," she said quietly. Ethan shrugged. "You are not interrupting anything." His date set her fork down. The sound against the plate seemed louder than it should have been. "Actually, she kind of is." Ethan glanced toward her. His expression remained calm. "A person asking for food is not an inconvenience." The woman crossed her arms. Maybe not to you. A heavy silence settled over the table. Around the restaurant, several customers continued pretending not to watch. Victoria suddenly wished she had chosen a different plan. What began as a simple test was becoming something much more complicated. Ethan looked back at her. Please sit down. Slowly, Victoria took the seat beside him. The manager approached cautiously. Sir, are you sure? Ethan smiled. Absolutely. The manager nodded and handed Victoria a menu. Order whatever you would like. She stared at the menu without opening it. In her entire life, nobody had ever spoken to her quite like this. Not because she was wealthy. Not because she was powerful. Simply because she was another human being. The realization felt strangely unsettling. A server arrived a few moments later. Ethan ordered dinner for everyone at the table before Victoria could protest. You do not have to do that, she said. I know. Ethan folded the menu and handed it back. I want to. His answer lingered in the air. Across the table, his date looked increasingly frustrated. The evening she imagined was disappearing one awkward minute at a time. Once the server left, conversation became difficult. Nobody seemed sure what to say. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. So what is your name? Victoria nearly answered with her real one. At the last second, she stopped herself. Claire. Ethan nodded. Nice to meet you, Claire. You are not going to ask questions? What kind of questions? About why I am here. Ethan leaned back slightly. If you want to tell me, you will. Victoria stared at him. Most people were curious by nature. Most people demanded explanations. Ethan seemed comfortable allowing others their dignity. It was a small thing, yet somehow it mattered. The meals arrived a few minutes later. The smell of warm bread and roasted chicken filled the table. Victoria realized she had barely eaten all day. For several moments, nobody spoke as they began eating. Then Ethan smiled toward her. Good. She nodded. Very. His date sighed heavily. I still do not understand why we are doing this. Ethan looked at her. Doing what? Turning our dinner into a charity event. The words landed harder than she intended. Victoria immediately lowered her eyes. Several nearby customers glanced over. Ethan remained calm. Helping somebody eat dinner is not a charity event. You know what I mean. Actually, I do not. The woman shook her head. You always do this. Ethan frowned slightly. Do what? Try to save everyone. Ethan laughed softly. Buying someone dinner is not exactly saving the world. Victoria watched the exchange carefully. Something unexpected was happening. The person becoming uncomfortable was not Ethan. It was the woman sitting across from him. The rest of the evening continued in much the same way. Ethan treated Victoria with simple kindness. No pity. No judgment. No dramatic speeches. Just respect. Meanwhile, his date seemed increasingly annoyed by every passing minute. By the time dessert arrived, the atmosphere felt completely different from the one that existed earlier. Eventually, Ethan excused himself to make a quick phone call outside. As soon as he left, the woman leaned across the table toward Victoria. I hope you are happy. Victoria blinked. Excuse me. You completely ruined tonight. Before Victoria could respond, the woman stood and grabbed her purse. Honestly, maybe you did me a favor. Then she walked toward the exit without another word. Through the restaurant window, Victoria watched her leave. A few moments later, Ethan returned and noticed the empty chair. Where did she go? Victoria looked at him carefully. This was the moment she expected disappointment. Maybe frustration. Maybe regret. Instead, Ethan simply glanced toward the parking lot and smiled sadly. I guess that answers a few questions. And for the second time that evening, Victoria realized the test was not going the way she planned. The restaurant slowly returned to normal after the woman left, but something had shifted. The conversations resumed. Plates clinked softly against tables. Waiters moved between customers carrying trays and coffee cups. Yet Victoria found herself watching Ethan more closely than ever. He did not look angry. He did not complain. He did not even seem surprised. He simply sat back down and finished his dinner. You are taking that remarkably well, Victoria said. Ethan smiled faintly. Taking what well? Your date leaving. Ethan stirred his coffee. People usually tell you who they are eventually. Victoria studied him. And that does not bother you? Ethan shrugged. I would rather learn now than later. The answer lingered in her mind. Most people she knew spent enormous amounts of energy trying to impress others. Ethan seemed interested only in understanding them. 20 minutes later, they walked out of the restaurant together. The evening air felt cool and fresh. Streetlights illuminated the sidewalk. Cars moved steadily through the city streets. Victoria expected him to say goodbye and leave. Instead, Ethan handed her a small paper bag containing 2 sandwiches. "What is this?" she asked. "Breakfast." She blinked. "Breakfast? You said you had not eaten much today." Victoria stared at the bag. "You already bought me dinner." Ethan smiled. "Tomorrow still exists." For a moment, she forgot how to respond. Then he wished her a good evening and walked toward his truck. Victoria stood alone on the sidewalk, watching him disappear into traffic. The paper bag felt strangely heavy in her hands. The next morning, she sat inside her penthouse apartment overlooking downtown Columbus. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a skyline most people would envy. Expensive artwork decorated the walls. A personal chef prepared meals downstairs. Yet her attention remained fixed on 2 simple sandwiches resting on the kitchen counter. They looked completely out of place. So did the thoughts occupying her mind. Why? She asked herself quietly. Why had he helped her? Why had he trusted a stranger? Why had he shown kindness when nobody expected him to? The questions followed her into work. During executive meetings, she found herself distracted. During conference calls, she caught herself replaying every moment from the restaurant. By noon, curiosity had become impossible to ignore. That afternoon, she made a decision. If she wanted answers, she needed to learn more about Ethan Brooks. Not the version people saw in public, the real version. 2 days later, wearing the same disguise, Victoria found herself sitting on a bench across from a small neighborhood bookstore. A hand-painted sign above the entrance read Brooks Books. Through the front window, she could see Ethan arranging displays while helping customers. The store was modest but welcoming. Warm lighting filled the interior. Children wandered between shelves. Elderly customers chatted comfortably near reading chairs. Nobody seemed rushed. Nobody seemed stressed. Around 3 o'clock, a little girl burst through the front door carrying a backpack nearly half her size. "Dad!" Ethan immediately looked up. His entire face brightened. "Hey, Em." The girl launched herself into a hug. Ethan laughed and lifted her off the ground. Victoria watched from across the street. The sight caught her completely off guard. Emma Brooks was 9 years old, energetic, and apparently the center of Ethan's universe. Within minutes, the two were shelving books together while discussing school projects and spelling tests. Their conversation drifted through the open doorway whenever customers entered or exited. "Did you finish your science assignment?" Ethan asked. "Almost. Almost is not finished." Emma groaned dramatically. Ethan laughed. The sound carried all the way across the street. Victoria continued watching for nearly an hour. She saw Ethan help an elderly customer carry purchases to her car. She saw him give a free children's book to a young boy whose family could not afford it. She saw him patiently listen to a lonely man who clearly wanted someone to talk to. Most importantly, she noticed something nobody else seemed to realize. Ethan behaved exactly the same way when nobody important was watching. There were no cameras, no publicity, no audience. Just kindness repeated quietly throughout an ordinary afternoon. As the sun began setting behind the buildings, Victoria stood from the bench. The disguise suddenly felt different now. Less like a game, less like a test. Because for the first time since this strange plan began, she was no longer investigating a man. She was discovering a character she had not expected to find. And deep down, that discovery was beginning to change her. 3 days later, Victoria found herself standing outside Brooks Books once again. The disguise felt familiar now. The worn coat, the faded shoes, the knit cap. What had started as a scheme had somehow become a routine. She told herself she was gathering information. The truth was becoming harder to ignore. She wanted to understand Ethan. The bookstore bell chimed softly as she stepped inside. Warm light spilled across wooden shelves lined with novels, biographies, and children's stories. The smell of paper and coffee filled the air. It was the kind of place people entered intending to stay for 5 minutes and somehow remained for an hour. Ethan looked up from the front counter and immediately recognized her. "Claire." Victoria almost smiled. "Hello." Ethan pointed toward a small reading area near the window. "Coffee. You do not even know if I can pay for it. Good thing I was not planning to charge you." Victoria shook her head. "You are impossible." Ethan laughed. "I hear that occasionally." A few minutes later, she sat near the window holding a warm paper cup while pretending to read a book she had no intention of finishing. Across the room, Ethan helped customers, organized shelves, and answer questions. The longer she watched him, the more confused she became. She had spent years surrounded by ambitious people. People chasing promotions, contracts, recognition, influence. Yet Ethan seemed perfectly content helping a teenager find a history book or recommending a mystery novel to a retired teacher. There was a peace about him that felt increasingly rare. Around lunchtime, a delivery driver entered carrying several large boxes. The young man looked exhausted. Sweat covered his forehead despite the cool weather outside. Ethan immediately noticed. Rough day. The driver laughed tiredly. You could say that. Ethan disappeared into the back room and returned with a sandwich and a bottle of water. Take 10 minutes. I cannot. You can. The driver accepted the food with obvious gratitude. Victoria watched silently. No cameras. No audience. No benefit. Just kindness. Again. Later that afternoon, Ethan closed the bookstore for an hour and walked with Emma to a nearby park. Victoria followed from a distance. Children ran across playground equipment while parents sat on benches beneath colorful autumn trees. Ethan pushed Emma on a swing while listening to a detailed explanation about a school project involving the solar system. His attention never drifted. His phone remained in his pocket. The world could have disappeared, and he probably would not have noticed. Emma suddenly pointed toward an elderly man struggling with several grocery bags near the parking lot. Before she could even say anything, Ethan was already walking over to help. The old man smiled gratefully as Ethan carried the bags to his car. Victoria felt something tighten in her chest. This was becoming a pattern, not occasional kindness. Consistent kindness. Character repeated until it became identity. As the afternoon faded into evening, another opportunity presented itself. Victoria decided to test him again. This time she sat outside a small coffee shop near the bookstore. Temperatures had dropped significantly. Wind moved fallen leaves across the sidewalk. She positioned herself near the entrance and waited. About 20 minutes later, Ethan emerged carrying 2 drinks. He spotted her immediately. Claire. She looked up. Hello. Ethan frowned. You should not be sitting out here. Why? Because it is cold. Victoria almost laughed. That is your concern? Ethan handed her one of the cups. Steam rose into the evening air. You need something warm. She stared at the drink. You bought this for me. Seems that way. Victoria looked away. Something about his kindness was becoming difficult to process. She had expected limits. She had expected conditions. She had expected him to eventually become annoyed. Instead, every new test seemed to reveal the same thing. Respect, grace, compassion, the qualities people often claim to have, but rarely demonstrate consistently. As darkness settled across the city, Ethan prepared to leave. Before walking away, he paused. Claire, yes. You know you do not have to do this alone, right? Victoria's heart skipped unexpectedly. Do what? Ethan smiled gently. Whatever it is you are carrying. Then he left. The wind continued moving through the trees. Cars passed beneath glowing streetlights. Victoria remained frozen on the bench holding the untouched cup of coffee. Because for the first time since this strange game began, she realized something uncomfortable. She was no longer testing Ethan's character. She was measuring it against her own. The following week brought colder weather and longer evenings. Leaves covered the sidewalks around downtown Columbus, painting the streets in shades of gold and amber. Yet despite the changing season, one thing remained constant. Victoria could not stop thinking about Ethan Brooks. Every attempt to return to normal failed. Board meetings felt less important. Quarterly reports seemed strangely empty. The conversations that once dominated her attention now sounded distant. Somewhere between the restaurant and the bookstore, something inside her had shifted. One afternoon, she found herself parked across the street from Brooks Books again. She remained inside the car for several minutes, staring through the windshield. This is becoming ridiculous, she muttered. Yet she did not leave. Instead, she pulled the knit cap over her hair, put on the worn coat, and stepped back into the role she had originally created as a disguise. Inside the bookstore, Ethan was helping Emma decorate a small display for an upcoming children's reading event. Colorful paper stars hung from the shelves. Handwritten signs rested beside stacks of books. Emma stood on a small step stool, trying to attach decorations, while Ethan offered completely unhelpful advice. I think it should be crooked. Emma laughed. No. A little crooked. Definitely no. Ethan placed a hand over his heart. That hurts. Victoria smiled before she realized she was smiling. The bell above the entrance chimed. Ethan looked up immediately. Claire. Emma turned toward the door. Who is Claire? Victoria froze. Ethan laughed. A friend. Emma studied her curiously. Children often see things adults miss. You look sad. Victoria blinked. That is quite an introduction. Emma shrugged. You kind of do. Ethan tried not to laugh. Emma. What? Maybe we do not start conversations like that. Emma smiled innocently. Victoria surprised herself by laughing. It was genuine, natural, unplanned. For a brief moment, she forgot about disguises and secrets entirely. Over the next hour, she helped organize books for the event. Nobody asked questions. Nobody demanded explanations. She simply became part of the afternoon. Customers came and went. Children searched for stories. Parents browsed shelves. The bookstore felt less like a business and more like a community. At one point, an elderly woman entered carrying a small box. Ethan immediately walked over. Mrs. Parker. The woman smiled warmly. I brought cookies. You spoil us. Nonsense. Victoria watched as Ethan introduced Emma to every customer by name. He remembered birthdays, favorite authors, family members, tiny details most people forgot. The more she observed, the clearer something became. Ethan's life was not large by conventional standards. He did not run corporations. He did not appear on magazine covers. He did not command boardrooms. Yet everywhere he went, people seemed genuinely happy to see him. Respect earned through kindness carries a different weight than respect earned through power. Later that evening, after the bookstore closed, Ethan and Emma began stacking chairs. Victoria prepared to leave. Thank you for helping, Ethan said. I did not really do much. You stayed. The answer caught her off guard. Ethan locked the front door and switched off several lights. Outside, street lamps cast soft reflections across the sidewalk. Emma climbed into the passenger seat of Ethan's truck while Victoria stood nearby. You know, Ethan said, you never talk about yourself. Her heartbeat quickened slightly. Maybe I am not very interesting. Ethan laughed. I do not believe that. For a moment, she almost told him everything. The company, the office tower, the truth. Instead, she looked away. Maybe another time. Ethan nodded respectfully. No pressure. No interrogation. Just patience. As Victoria drove home that night, she realized something unsettling. The original plan had completely failed. She no longer wanted to expose a weakness in Ethan. She no longer wanted to ruin anything. Instead, she found herself hoping he would continue being exactly the person he was. And that realization left her staring silently at the city lights outside her penthouse window long after midnight. Because for the first time in years, she was not impressed by success. She was impressed by character. And deep inside, she was beginning to feel ashamed of the reason she met him in the first place. The guilt arrived quietly. Not all at once. Not in some dramatic moment. It appeared in small pieces throughout ordinary days. Victoria noticed it during meetings when executives praised her judgment. She noticed it when people complimented her leadership. Most of all, she noticed it whenever Ethan smiled and called her Claire. Every kind word felt heavier than the one before. Every act of trust made the secret harder to carry. One rainy Thursday evening, she sat alone inside her office long after everyone else had gone home. The city lights reflected against the glass walls surrounding her. Reports covered her desk. Emails waited for responses. None of it held her attention. Her thoughts remained fixed on a small bookstore and a man who had shown her more honesty in a few weeks than many people had shown in years. Victoria leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. What are you doing? She whispered to herself. The answer was uncomfortable. She had started this entire situation because of jealousy. Then curiosity had taken over. Now regret was replacing both. The next afternoon, she found herself walking toward Brooks Books once again. Rain had stopped earlier, leaving the sidewalks damp and shining beneath a gray sky. She almost turned around twice before reaching the entrance. The bell chimed softly as she stepped inside. Ethan looked up from a display table. His face brightened immediately. Claire. The simple warmth in his voice made her chest tighten. Hi. Emma sat nearby working on homework. She waved enthusiastically. You are back. Victoria smiled. Looks like it. The bookstore was quiet that day. Only a few customers browsed among the shelves. Soft music played through overhead speakers. Outside, clouds drifted slowly across the afternoon sky. Ethan poured a cup of coffee and handed it to her without asking. You always know I am going to say yes. I am becoming very confident. She laughed softly. Then the laughter faded. Something about the ordinary kindness of the moment made her feel worse than ever. Ethan noticed immediately. You okay? Victoria hesitated. Can I ask you something? Of course. She stared into the coffee cup. Have you ever regretted giving someone a second chance? Ethan considered the question carefully. Sometimes. She looked up. Really? He nodded. People are complicated. Then why keep doing it? Ethan leaned against a bookshelf. Sunlight briefly emerged through the clouds, casting warm light across the room. Because occasionally somebody surprises you. The answer lingered between them. Victoria looked away first. Later that evening, after the bookstore closed, Ethan and Emma walked her toward the bus stop she occasionally pretended to use. The city felt peaceful after the rain. Streetlights reflected across wet pavement. Cars moved quietly through the intersection nearby. Emma skipped ahead for a few moments before stopping to examine a store window. Ethan lowered his voice slightly. You seem worried lately. Victoria swallowed. Maybe I am. About what? She almost told him. For one brief second, the truth sat right there at the edge of her lips. Then fear stopped her. Fear that he would feel betrayed. Fear that everything would change. Fear that she had already ruined something meaningful before it even had a chance to become real. Nothing important, she said. Ethan studied her expression. He clearly did not believe the answer. Yet once again, he chose respect over pressure. Whenever you are ready. Victoria looked at him. Ready for what? Ethan smiled gently. To tell the truth about whatever is bothering you. The words hit harder than he realized. Because the truth was exactly what terrified her. Emma suddenly ran back toward them. Dad, hurry up. Ethan laughed. Coming. They continued walking together beneath the glow of the streetlights. To anyone passing by, it looked like three ordinary people sharing an ordinary evening. Yet inside Victoria, a storm was building. Every day made the secret heavier. Every conversation made the confession more necessary. What began as a test had become something entirely different. Admiration, respect, maybe even something deeper. And for the first time since she created the disguise, Victoria understood a difficult truth. The greatest risk was no longer being discovered. The greatest risk was losing the trust of the one person whose opinion had unexpectedly started to matter most. The confession happened on a cold Tuesday evening. Victoria had spent nearly a week trying to convince herself there was a better way. There was not. Every alternative required another lie. Every delay made the truth heavier. By the time she parked outside Brooks Books that night, her hands were trembling slightly on the steering wheel. Rain fell softly against the windshield. The bookstore lights glowed warmly through the darkness. For several minutes, she simply sat there staring at the entrance. Then she made a decision. No more disguises. No more pretending. No more hiding. Inside the store, Ethan was helping Emma organize books for the next day's reading program. The bell above the door chimed. Both looked up automatically. Emma smiled at first. Then her expression changed. The woman standing in the doorway was not Claire. The worn coat was gone. The knit cap was gone. In their place stood a confident woman wearing a tailored navy coat and professional attire. Ethan stared for several seconds without speaking. Recognition slowly appeared in his eyes. Victoria Sterling, the executive from the charity event months ago. The powerful business leader whose face occasionally appeared on magazine covers. Emma looked confused. Dad, do you know her? Ethan did not answer immediately. His eyes never left Victoria. Yes, he said quietly. I think I do. The bookstore suddenly felt very still. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Customers browsed nearby shelves unaware that something important was unfolding. Victoria swallowed hard. For the first time in years, she felt completely uncertain. Can we talk? Ethan nodded slowly. Emma, sweetheart, can you finish organizing the children's section? Emma sensed the seriousness immediately. Sure. A few moments later, Ethan led Victoria to a small reading area near the back of the store. The same place where they had shared countless conversations while she was pretending to be someone else. Neither sat down. Finally, Ethan spoke. How long? Victoria lowered her eyes. Since the restaurant. Silence. The first night. She nodded. Ethan exhaled slowly. Not angry. Not dramatic. Just disappointed. Somehow that felt worse. Your name is not Claire. No. You were never homeless. No. Ethan looked away for a moment. The rain continued falling outside. Why? Victoria had rehearsed dozens of explanations. None sounded good anymore. Because I was jealous. The honesty surprised even her. Ethan turned back toward her. She continued before courage disappeared. I heard you were going on a date. I told myself it was none of my business. Then I became curious. Then I became foolish. Ethan listened quietly. So you created a test. Victoria nodded. I wanted to see who you really were. Ethan laughed softly. There was no humor in the sound. And her eyes filled with emotion. I found someone better than I expected. Silence returned. The kind that forces people to sit with uncomfortable truths. Finally, Ethan walked to the window and stared out at the rain. You know what hurts the most? Victoria felt her chest tighten. What? Not the disguise. He paused. The fact that you assumed kindness needed to be verified. The words landed gently, yet they carried tremendous weight. Victoria looked down. You are right. Ethan remained quiet. The bookstore around them continued operating normally. Pages turned. Customers chatted softly. Life moved forward. Yet for both of them, everything had changed. After several moments, Victoria took a deep breath. I am sorry. Ethan did not respond immediately. She continued. I am sorry for the lies. I am sorry for the manipulation. I am sorry for treating your life like an experiment. Her voice trembled slightly. Most of all, I am sorry because somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as a test and started seeing you as a person. Ethan slowly turned toward her. For the first time that evening, he saw no disguise. No performance. No carefully controlled executive. Just a woman carrying genuine regret. Why tell me now, he asked. Victoria answered honestly. Because every day I waited made me respect you less and respect myself less. The bookstore fell silent in her mind. The world seemed to narrow to that single moment. Ethan studied her expression carefully. Then he nodded once. Not forgiveness. Not rejection. Simply acknowledgement. And as the rain continued falling beyond the windows, both of them understood that the truth had finally arrived. What happened next would depend entirely on character. The morning after the confession felt strangely quiet. Rain clouds had disappeared overnight, leaving behind clear skies and crisp autumn air. Yet inside Brooks' books, an invisible distance lingered. Ethan arrived early as usual. He unlocked the front door, turned on the lights, and prepared the store for another day. Everything looked the same. Nothing felt the same. Truth has a way of rearranging a room, even when nobody moves the furniture. Throughout the morning, Ethan found himself replaying the conversation. Victoria Sterling. The disguise. The lies. The reason behind it all. None of it made sense when viewed separately. Together, however, it painted a picture he could not ignore. He was not angry. At least not in the way most people expected. He simply felt disappointed. Not because she was wealthy. Not because she was successful. Because she had never trusted honesty enough to begin with it. Around noon, Emma noticed her father's distraction. You are thinking too loud. Ethan looked up from a stack of invoices. Thinking too loud. Emma nodded. That thing you do when your face gets serious. Ethan laughed softly. I did not know I had a serious face. You definitely do. She paused. Is this about Claire? Ethan remained silent for a moment. Then he nodded. Emma set her book down. She is not really Claire, is she? Children often reach conclusions faster than adults. Ethan smiled. No. Emma looked thoughtful rather than surprised. I kind of guessed. You did. Nobody who needs help wears shoes that expensive. Ethan stared at her. You noticed that? Emma shrugged. Dad, I read mystery books. The answer made him laugh despite everything. Meanwhile, across town, Victoria sat inside a conference room surrounded by executives discussing a major acquisition. Charts covered large screens. Financial projections filled the walls. Millions of dollars were being debated. Nobody noticed that their chief executive officer had barely spoken for the last hour. Her mind remained somewhere else entirely. Finally, one executive cleared his throat. Victoria? She looked up. Sorry. Would you like to review the proposal? Victoria glanced toward the documents. For years, situations like this had been her entire world. Today they felt strangely small. Send it to me later. After the meeting ended, she stood alone beside the office windows overlooking downtown Columbus. Her reflection stared back at her through the glass. Confident. Successful. Accomplished. Yet for the first time in years, those words offered little comfort. Character is difficult to measure until it collides with truth. By late afternoon, she made another decision. Running from consequences would only prove Ethan right. She drove to the bookstore without calling ahead. When she arrived, the bell above the door chimed softly. Conversations immediately paused. Several customers recognized her. A few whispered quietly. Victoria Sterling was not the kind of person people expected to see in a neighborhood bookstore. Ethan looked up from behind the counter. Their eyes met. Neither spoke at first. The store suddenly felt much smaller. Finally, Victoria walked forward. "Can we talk?" Ethan nodded. A few moments later, they stood near the same reading corner where the truth had been revealed. Sunlight streamed through nearby windows. Dust floated gently through the light. The atmosphere felt calm despite the tension. Victoria took a breath. "I am not here to defend what I did." Ethan listened quietly. "Good." She nodded. "Because there is no defense." Another silence followed. Not hostile. Honest. "Then why are you here?" Ethan asked. Victoria looked around the bookstore. The shelves. The reading chairs. The small community he had built. Then she looked back at him. "Because if I disappear now, it means everything we talked about was fake." Ethan remained silent. "And it was not fake," she continued. "The disguise was fake. The name was fake. But what I learned about you was real. What I felt afterward was real too." For the first time, Ethan saw something different in her. Not confidence. Vulnerability. A quality rarely found in boardrooms. Rarely displayed by people accustomed to control. "You hurt me," he said calmly. Victoria nodded immediately. "I know. You manipulated a situation that did not belong to you. I know. And you turned a person into a test." Her eyes lowered. "I know." The bookstore grew quiet again. Yet something important had changed. For the first time since the confession, nobody was hiding. No disguises. No games. No performances. Just two imperfect people standing in the truth. And as the afternoon sunlight filled the room, everyone nearby sensed what was happening. The lesson was no longer about exposing character. It was about taking responsibility for it. The conversation in the bookstore did not end with dramatic speeches or instant forgiveness. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, it ended with honesty. And sometimes honesty is enough to begin healing. Over the next several days, Victoria stopped trying to control the outcome. She did not send gifts. She did not make grand gestures. She did not use her influence or resources to change how Ethan felt. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, she simply accepted responsibility and allowed someone else the freedom to decide what happened next. That choice mattered more than she realized. A week later, the bookstore hosted its monthly children's reading event. Families filled the small building. Parents gathered near coffee tables while children sat cross-legged on colorful rugs listening to stories. The atmosphere felt warm and familiar. Near the back of the room, Victoria quietly entered and took a seat. No disguise. No performance. Just herself. Several people recognized her. A few looked surprised. Nobody said much. Emma spotted her first. The young girl waved enthusiastically. Victoria smiled and waved back. Ethan noticed the exchange. For a moment, their eyes met across the room. Neither looked away. Something had changed. The tension was gone. Not because everything had been forgotten. Because everything had finally been faced. After the event ended and families began leaving, Victoria helped stack chairs without being asked. Ethan noticed. So did everyone else. There was something strangely powerful about seeing a person stop defending themselves and simply start doing the next right thing. Emma carried a box of books toward a shelf and nearly dropped it. Victoria stepped forward immediately. "I have it." Emma smiled. "Thanks." Then the little girl paused. "You know, Dad is still disappointed." Victoria laughed softly. "I know." Emma nodded seriously. "But he is not disappointed because you are important." Victoria looked confused. "What do you mean?" Emma carefully considered her words. "He is disappointed because he liked you." The answer hit harder than any criticism ever could. Children often say difficult truths with remarkable simplicity. Later that evening, after the last customer left, Ethan locked the front door and began turning off lights. Victoria stood near the reading corner where so many conversations had happened. The bookstore felt peaceful. Outside, the first signs of winter moved through the city. Inside, something gentler was unfolding. Ethan walked over and stopped beside her. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Finally, he smiled faintly. "Emma talks too much." Victoria laughed. "She definitely gets that from you." "That is unfair." "Completely fair." The familiar rhythm of their conversations returned naturally. No disguise. No hidden agenda. Just honesty. Ethan looked around the bookstore. Do you know what bothered me most? Victoria nodded. The lie. Ethan shook his head. Not exactly. She waited. It was the idea that you thought character only appears when someone is being tested. Victoria remained silent. Ethan continued. The truth is simpler than that. He looked toward the front window where streetlights glowed against the evening sky. Character appears every day. In small choices. In ordinary moments. When nobody is keeping score. The words settled quietly between them. Victoria felt tears gather in her eyes. Not from sadness. From recognition. She had spent years building a reputation. Ethan had spent years building a life. One impressed people. The other changed them. After a long moment, she finally spoke. Can you forgive me? Ethan smiled gently. The same calm smile she first saw in the restaurant. The same one that survived every test, every misunderstanding, and every disappointment. I already did. Silence followed. Not awkward silence. Healing silence. The kind that arrives when truth no longer has anything left to prove. Across the room, Emma pretended not to watch while clearly watching everything. Ethan noticed and laughed. Victoria laughed too. And for the first time since this strange journey began, nobody was pretending to be someone else. The bookstore remained small. The city continued moving outside. The world did not stop. Yet in that quiet corner of Columbus, Ohio, something extraordinary happened. A man chose grace over resentment. A woman chose accountability over pride. And both discovered that second chances are not earned through perfection. They are earned through honesty. Sometimes the people who change our lives are not the ones who impress us. They are the ones who remind us who we want to become. If this story touched your heart, share what moment stayed with you the longest. And if you believe dignity, kindness, and second chances still matter, we would be honored to have you join us again for another story of grace, redemption, and quiet strength.